First of all, I would like to thank the Mises Institute for inviting me to this conference. It's always a great pleasure to take part in this. To my eyes, the most important instructional conference on Austrian economics in the world. At least I would have to know about a more important one. And it's a true pleasure to be here. Also, it helps me to improve, keep up my English now that I'm in the land that the Germans love so much that we offer twice governing services. The French refused, so now we're taking them on one by one. And I've started with a professorship there. And it also might help you to improve your French, right? If I should ever slip into French, it will stop me. Of Hayek, it is said that once, after a Montpellier Society meeting in Berlin, he asked Milton Friedman how he liked his lecture. And then Milton Friedman said, well, dear colleague, I didn't understand a word. You gave it in German. So I hope the same thing wouldn't happen to me today. In any case, we'll start off in English. So my subject is capital and interest, and it is a follow-up, of course, on the previous lectures, and it's a preparation of the other lectures that are to come. And the starting point is that in Austrian economics, we try to identify causal laws of human action. So we are not happy with just identifying functional relationships, but we're looking for causal relationships. That is, relationships that link different events at different points of time. Human choices, of course, is human action itself, is a causal factor. That is clear. But in our lecture, we have to take our point of departure from an important fact, namely that human choices take place in a physical and social environment. So choices don't take place in a vacuum. They take place in a physical and social environment, and this environment is determined in itself by causal laws. So we have here the laws of production and certain laws of society. And in identifying these laws and making use of this knowledge, human beings can apply them, and they apply them most notably, and this is one of the things that we will discuss, in the division of labor and for the accumulation of capital. So if we ask for the most important mechanisms of human progress, if we ask for the reasons why at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, we have reached an accumulation of wealth and well-being for millions and even billions of people in the world on an unprecedented scale, the most two important factors that here come into play are the division of labor and the accumulation of capital. And of course, the most important condition for this to take place are private property rights. That's something that has been addressed in other lectures and will be still addressed in other lectures. So we'll be dealing today with the question how the division of labor and the accumulation of capital can increase well-being, wealth for human beings, and how capital and interest come here into play. We will first talk about the laws of production, the most important type of laws of production, which are the laws of return, and then talk about how these laws of return can be applied, how the physical return of human labor can be increased through cooperation with other human beings and through capital accumulation, and then have a closer look at the conditions for capital formation, its effects, and its causes, the causes of capital accumulation. So first, the laws of return. So we have here physical laws of nature, which the most important characteristic of which is that the effects that result from the use of any single factor of production are limited, first of all, and that further increases of use of this factor of production brings about diminishing returns. That is the law of return. So we'll have a short diagram here. Of course, I'm in a line of, part of a famous line of German painters. So we have here x, that's any factor of production, and output is the total output that this factor of production produces in conjunction with other factors of production. And so what we typically observe then is such a relationship. Okay? That is, we have at first, as we increase the use of the factor of production, an increase in total output until we reach a point of saturation, and then the total output starts actually decreasing and it can become even negative. Why is this so? Is it a purely empirical observation? It is not. It is, rather it has a metaphysical or a priori foundation, which is the fact that all physical things are limited. That is, they're not only circumscribed within physical limits. For example, this pen has a certain dimension. What more, it is limited. My voice can be heard within this room, but not until Opelika. Cars have certain speeds. Standing space is only so and so much, cannot cover an indefinite amount, and so on. And because of these physical limitations, the results or the effects that can be created with the help of any such limited objects can in themselves also only be limited. Now, the saturation comes about not because of our factor of production, which is increasing, but because of the limitations of the effects that can be obtained from the cooperating factors of production. Okay, let me give you one or two examples. First example would be the use of a fertilizer to produce wheat. Okay, so then we would have here X would be fertilizer in kilograms, right, or in pounds, however you like it, and the output would be wheat in tons. Okay, and you have this functional relationship, and what limits the output that can be achieved with the help of the fertilizer, which creates the saturation point, is that the other cooperating factors of production, in particular the fertility of the natural fertility of the soil, is in itself limited, as is the power of the fertilizer itself. Right? So the further increase of the use of the fertilizer cannot bring us an indefinite product, because the productive power of the other factors of production, for example the soil that on which we use this fertilizer, is in itself limited. Right? It cannot produce indefinite amounts. If this were not the case, if this functional relationship did not hold, then we could use any amount of wheat, right, on the most tiny piece of land. Right? We might have just a hectare of land, for example. And if no such saturation point would be reached, but if the curve would go further up and up and up, then we could produce all the wheat in the world on this hectare of land, okay, which is clearly not the case. Another example that, since most of you are not agricultural economists or working anymore on the fields and so on, but another example that you might like more is, let's say, the production of coffees being served in a restaurant, okay? So there are two various factors of production come into place. For example, the waiters, and the number of tables, the location of the coffee shop. Well, it's a nice square in Angers, for example, or a somewhat less nicer place in Harlem or so. These are all factors of production that come into place. And if we say here X, for example, is the number of waiters that the restaurant owner employs, right, then the same functional relationship obtains. Only, of course, we could not express it with a continuous curve, right? We would have to use dots in this case. So you get it, right? But then again, right, increasing the numbers of waiters can increase the number of coffees served only up to a point. Beyond this point, right, the waiter starts standing on each other's feet. They don't move anymore. Right, so the numbers of coffees served does no longer increase, it actually decreases. Okay, so this is the law of return, the most important form of it. There are variations of it. We can imagine that there are several maxima here at place, but what we always have is a maximum and a final decrease of the production. Now, in economic analysis, we usually add the following curve to this. So this would be the curve of physical productivity. of physical product and this here would be the curve of marginal physical productivity. And this marginal physical productivity is thus declining, and it crosses the axis at precisely the point where we reach saturation. That's where we have the maximum of the curve from which it is derived. So far for the application of mathematics in Austrian economics, it usually ends there. So we have here this curve of marginal physical productivity, and I would like to introduce a term that is not very often used, but which is useful for my presentation, namely, in order to describe this limitation here that creates a saturation point, we might say that at this point here we have a bottleneck. Okay, so the further use of any one factor of production sooner or later confronts a bottleneck, and this bottleneck is caused by the limitations of the physical productivity of the cooperating factors of production. And so if you wish, all human endeavors to increase or to enhance human well-being can be subsumed under the heading of increasing the bottleneck. Right? You have a bottleneck of a bottle has a certain diameter. You need to get the water out, right? So that's your production. And the most important way for us to get the water out quicker, to increase our well-being in a faster way, is to increase this diameter, to increase the bottleneck. So how do we do this? And here we'll see that human cooperation with other human beings and saving investment are the two most important techniques to do this. Before we come to the discussion of these two techniques, let me introduce another diagram that we often use even in Austrian economics, and this wonderful painting, namely the production possibility frontier. If the production of any one product has decreasing returns, that is, a greater investment of human labor, I only produce an ever more tiny additional product, then it follows that the following functional relationship between any two productions obtains. Let's say I can produce either X or Y. This can be any pair, right? It could be, typically economists use the example guns and butter. Right? So the more guns I produce, let's say X is guns, the less butter I can produce. If I use all my work to produce guns, which can be very nice, and nice riffles around Smith & Wesson and various other wonderful brands. If I use all my resources to produce guns, then it's clear that I cannot produce any butter, right? I have a maximum of gun production here, but zero butter production. Right? If I use all my resources, all my human labor to produce butter, it's clear that I don't have guns. And there must be this concave relationship between the two products because of decreasing physical returns. So I said, the main question that we have from a practical point of view, if you want to be better off, if we want to make human life materially more rewarding, we want to increase our wealth, the two most important techniques are human cooperation and saving investment. Let me first talk a little bit about human cooperation, because that's not the main topic of my lecture, but I need to mention it anyway. So what we have here is, what we need to do here is to compare human production as it would occur without cooperation with other human beings and human production as it would occur in cooperation with other human beings. Let me give you the following example. So we have here two individuals, John and Michael, and they're producing berries and chasing rabbits. So picking berries, plucking berries, and chasing rabbits. Okay? Now we have the following productivities here. John can pluck in 2 hours 300 grams of berries, and in the remaining 8 hours of a 10-hour workday, so it's not modern Germany here, right? He can chase 1 rabbit. Michael can pluck 700 grams of berries in 4 hours, and in the remaining 6 hours of the 10-hour workday, so he belongs to the same labor union, he can chase 3 rabbits. So total work, it's 10 hours for both of them, and the total product is 1,000 grams of berries and 4 rabbits chased. Okay, so that's before cooperation. Now, John and Michael might... You have a question?
Is it 4 rabbits chased or caught?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yeah, okay. 4 rabbits caught. Yeah, okay. Of course, he might chase, right, thousands of rabbits at the same time. Thank you. 4 rabbits caught. So now, so that was without cooperation. Now we have the case with cooperation. In this case, John might concentrate on berry picking, berry plucking. So he works 10 hours in the berry fields, and according to his productivity, in 2 hours he can pluck 300 grams of berries. So in 10 hours he might do 1,500 grams. And of course he can invest no time in rabbit chasing and will therefore catch no rabbit, so 0. On the other hand, Michael will spend no time on plucking berries, so 0 grams berries picked, but he will spend all his time, 10 hours, on chasing rabbits, and in fact catch 5 rabbits. Okay, so the total hours worked are again 10 hours and 10 hours. But now if we add up the total product, we come here to 1,500 grams and to 5 rabbits. Okay. Now the important comparison is of course 1,500 versus 1,000, and 5 is compared to 4, right? Which means that human cooperation increases the physical productivity of human labor, right, as by a miracle. And therefore, even if we abstract completely from the question how will the additional product be divided, right? However it will be divided, both of them will be better off, right? So why is this so? Why is this an application of the laws of decreasing returns? Well, what happens here, in fact, is that John and Michael are switching or swapping, as the financial economists would say, swapping their bottlenecks, right? John has a tinier bottleneck in rabbit chasing and a larger bottleneck in berry plucking. Michael has comparatively, as compared to John, a larger bottleneck in rabbit chasing and a tinier one in berry plucking. Right? So they switch. One of them concentrates entirely on the activity where he is relatively best, and the other one on the activity where he is relatively best. And the result is, result of the switching of bottlenecks is an increased overall total product. There's another feature that is interesting in my numerical example, namely what you see here is that Michael is actually better in both productions. And Mike is the better berry plucker, but he's also the better rabbit chaser, rabbit hunter. Right? So what the example proves, the simple numerical example proves, is that fruitful human cooperation is possible even between completely unequal individuals. If you have one Superman, right, and the other is completely the zero producer, it's not completely zero, it's much worse than everything else, right, much worse than everything, there's still fruitful human cooperation possible between them. Mike is not doing charity in cooperating with John. He's not doing him a favor. It's in his own interest to cooperate with somebody who is inferior in all fields. Right? So that's the great point that the classical economist, in particular David Ricardo, has raised, and which completely destroyed the prevailing social philosophy at the time, according to which the superior human beings had no personal interest in cooperating with inferior ones, and they were doing them favors, and in exchange for their favors, they could at least expect obedience. Right? So you had the division between masters and subjects, right? And it could not be otherwise because the masters had no personal interest in cooperating with the inferior subjects. So this new social philosophy that resulted from this insight completely revolutionized the understanding of human society. And it is a point that Ludwig von Mises emphasized in all of his writings, in particular in the writings that he published when he came to the US in 1940 and onwards. So human cooperation is one way to increase the physical productivity, and the other way, and that is of course the one that is of particular interest for us today, is saving and investment. Here again we take a numerical example. So the first one, the most famous example, has been developed by boehm-bawerk, who took the example of somebody is catching fish and uses capital accumulation to increase his physical productivity. So we have a fisherman who fishes and consumes the fish consumption. Let's say he catches 4 fish per day and needs only 2 for consumption to survive. That is, on the second day, he wouldn't have to work, right? Doesn't engage in fishing, but he can still consume the other 2 fish left over from the previous day. And then only on the third day, fishes again 4 fish and eats 2, and so on. Okay? So that would be the case of, well, a hand-to-mouth existence. Right? He's just working enough to keep going, but not more. But now there is another possibility. He can use day 2, on which he, in the previous case, did nothing. He can use the time to produce a net production. Okay? So on day 1 he catches 4 fish, he consumes 2, he has no time to produce a net, 0 net. On day 2 he does not catch any fish, he consumes the remaining 2 fishes and produces 1 net. Okay? The net will help him on day 3 to catch 7 fish. Okay? And again, consume 2, there's no production, no time for net production, so 0. And then from then on there are various cases imaginable. You can produce another net or a bigger one or whatever, and so on. But the important point is, so the production of the net of this tool allows him to increase his bottleneck, that is, the physical productivity of his human labor as from day 3 is largely increased, right? Which allows him in the future days to spend even more time on producing other things that he did not have no time producing before. So what we have here, in short, is the fact that the production of tools, or as they are also called, capital goods, so the net in our example is a capital good, increases the physical productivity of human labor because it increases the bottleneck of human labor. Now let's turn to analyze the conditions that must be given for capital formation. Right? So what happens here in this process is capital formation, a capital good has come into existence. What are the conditions for this to take place? Well, the most important condition for this to take place is saving. Okay? What our fisherman needs to do is to save some fish that allow him to bridge the time, that is to survive, to physically survive the time that he needs to produce his tool. Right? So capital formation necessarily is contingent on saving, on previous saving. Now let us observe that the saving can be used, of course saving per se does not bring about capital formation, rather an additional decision must go in hand with saving. Well, saving can be used in 3 ways. Right? The first way is to save and just have a good time. That was what our fisherman was doing in the first case, right? He was catching 4 fish on the first day, and then on day 2 he was doing nothing. He was just having a good time, laying on the beach, right? Singing songs, looking at the birds. Wonderful life, and so on. He was eating his 2 fish and was getting along. The next day he was again catching 4 fish, and so on and on and on. Right? So here the saving of the 2 fish on day 1 did not per se increase the physical productivity of his labor. Rather, what is necessary is an additional decision, namely to produce a net, that is to use the possibility that one has to survive a day without producing the bare necessities, namely fish, to produce something else. Right? And that is called, traditionally in economic analysis, is called investment. So we need to have an additional investment decision. But saving can also indirectly increase physical productivity, namely because it allows us to spend time thinking and thus improving our technology. Okay? So we have then here 2 ways, 2 mechanisms through which saving can increase physical productivity. One is investment. Savings can be used to produce new tools, but savings can also be used to keep us alive while we think about new ways of producing tools, or of producing the consumer goods that we do like. And that is a point that has been stressed not by an economist, but by a philosopher with the name of Pieper, Joseph Pieper. He died a couple of years ago and was one of the great German philosophers of the 20th century. And he developed a theory according to which leisure, which is only possible, as we know as economists, with the help of savings, that leisure is the foundation of civilization. What's the name? Pieper. Oh. So Joseph Pieper. Okay, so now we've talked about the conditions that must be given for capital formation, and we need to say a few words on the notion of capital, on the concept of capital. So in economic analysis, in particular in Austrian economic analysis, we distinguish the concept of capital goods from the concept of capital. Capital is the monetary equivalent of the capital goods. Okay? And this notion goes back to Karl Menger and has been used in particular by Ludwig von Mises later on. So we must not confuse the physical objects, the capital goods, nets and buses and machines and so on, with their monetary equivalent, that is capital. Why is capital important? Well, because as a monetary concept, it allows us to aggregate physically heterogeneous goods into one common expression. Right? If I did not have the concept of capital, if I did not have money prices, I, as an entrepreneur, for example, would be confronted only with an array of physically heterogeneous goods. Right? I would have 5 machines and a machine hall, and I would have 15 cars belonging to my company, and various sales offices and so on. But if I was asked, so how much capital do you have? I couldn't give any expression because they don't have a common denominator. Right? Only by using the concept of capital, that is, by adding up their monetary equivalents, do I come up with a common number. So the use of money allows capital accounting or monetary accounting, which would not be possible outside of a monetary economy. That's one of the fundamental points of Austrian economics, developed by Mises, as Professor Reiko has explained to you yesterday, and we'll have another lecture on this topic. And capital accounting is only possible in a monetary economy. So then let's have a closer look at the actual investment decisions. What is important in making my investment decision is, so we cannot just set out to produce any tool, any capital good. It must be a capital good that we can produce within the time span accorded to us due to the limitations of our savings. Right? Here in our example, the fisherman has 2 fish saved. That is, he can survive 1 day without catching fish. That is, he can produce tools that require a production time of 1 day. If he would set out to produce a tool that took longer than 1 day to produce, well, he would starve. Okay, he could not do this. So what he needs to do in making his investment decision is a judicious choice, not just any production of a tool, but a tool that can be produced within the time frame according to him, within the limitations of his savings. So what he does then is to make production more roundabout. He does not directly produce the fish. He produces the fish through an intermediate step, namely through the net. So we have a more roundabout production process. And the roundaboutness, the possible roundaboutness, is determined by the extent of our savings. Now, how does this translate into well-being, or into the material endowment of a society? Here again, we can use the production possibility frontier diagram. So we have again any 2 products, and there's a trade-off producing them. And let's say we produce both products with the help of tools, that is with capital goods, and using these capital goods leads to their deterioration, that is sooner or later they have to be replaced. Okay? Sooner or later we need to spend some time reproducing the capital goods. This is a capital good and this is a consumer good. A consumer good. Okay? So we can imagine a case in which we produce capital goods and consumer goods in just that proportion that stabilizes the well-being or the material endowment of our society. That point could be given, for example, here. Oh, no, sorry, let's take this one. This is more realistic. At this point, okay? So at this point, we produce that much of capital goods and that much of consumer goods, okay? So this would be, economists would call this the equilibrium of a stationary economy. It's an economy that just doesn't develop. It just stays where it is. Now, what happens if I make different investment choices, if I use a greater amount of my resources to produce additional capital goods and less of my consumption to just have a good time, right? You see, in this case here, let's say if I make this choice, would produce so much capital goods and so many capital goods and so many consumer goods, different use of my consumer goods. But this means that in a subsequent period, right, I will have available for myself a greater amount of capital goods, so the physical productivity of the economy is increasing. Right? As a consequence, the PPF moves, okay, in this direction, and it extends. And then if again, let's say my equilibrium, my stationary equilibrium point would be here, and I actually did pick this point, I chose to produce more capital goods than I needed just to keep this new PPF in a stationary state, then again in the next period, my PPF would grow even more. Okay? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is actually happening in a growing economy. This process is at the root of the fact that today we enjoy a living standard much superior to what any other previous generations before the 18th century enjoyed. Okay? That's the process that is here at stake. But we can, of course, also imagine the opposite case. We can imagine that we make a decision to consume more without producing than we would have to afford to consume without producing in a stationary state. Let's say if we made this investment, this decision here, we consumed so much, produce so many consumer goods and only so many capital goods. Well, the consequence would be that in the next period, the PPF would shrink. Okay? And then again, if we made similar decisions in the next period, it would again shrink. And this too has been observed again and again in the course of history, various cases of the decline of civilizations. In all cases, what happened was this, that the consumption of goods was greater than the replacement of capital goods, and as a consequence, the physical productivity of human labor declined, and so people got poorer and poorer, and ultimately started starving. So we here have then the effects of the accumulation of capital. This fact, as I said, that is most important for the understanding of the evolution of the past 200 years, most important for understanding the particularity of our civilization, and the impact of the classical economists. For what the classical economists, and one has to say, most importantly, Adam Smith did, was to stress precisely this point. Okay? The whole interest of classical economics was, it's reflected in the title of Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations. It's the question, what technique, what have I got to do in order to increase the wealth, not only for one individual? Well, that would be simple, right? You apply the Rothbard strategy, knock out the other guy, take his money, so you're richer, and the other is correspondingly poorer. Right? So that's an easy one. Everybody knew this before, but how can we make everybody better off? And so Smith and his fellow classical economists, right, we were from Say to Malthus and even John Stuart Mill, Ricardo, stress precisely this point. What you need to do is to increase the amount of capital goods per capita. And the only way to do this is to save. And so you need to have saving. In particular, it's a great error to believe that we can just count on technological progress. Right? We don't need to save, we just need to invent ever more fancy technologies. And that's an error because the new fancy technologies can also only be applied if we save. Okay? Of course, it's great to have a new technology because it makes human labor even more physically productive, but it can only be applied if we save. Right? That is, great ideas per se do not help us. What we need most of all is saving. Okay, now so far to capital. Now we come to the interest segment. Before I come to talk about this, let me briefly return to our example here of human cooperation. And what I said here is the important fact is that the overall physical product has increased. You don't have to deal at this point with the question how the distribution occurs. Now, what I want to add now is that there are various types of cooperation imaginable. In particular, we can distinguish two types. One is paid cooperation, the other one is unpaid cooperation. Unpaid cooperation, in particular in America, is called volunteering. Okay, as you work with other people, help them and so on, without insisting to be paid, right? Without any other compensation than the result of this labor. That's just what you're requiring. So that's volunteering. And the rest would be paid cooperation. Now, paid cooperation has sometimes, certainly with lefties, a negative moral connotation. Oh, how terrible! Why doesn't everybody volunteer? We could all be angels and get straight to heaven and so on. Why insist on being paid? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's just how the human nature is. Right? So there are some people who don't smell good and they have strange accents and terrible political opinions. We just don't like to work these people. Okay. What paid cooperation does, or what the additional incentive that comes through the payment does, is to increase human cooperation beyond the level that would be possible on the basis of pure volunteering. And if we just say pure volunteering, then everybody would just be doing what he likes, and human cooperation would be rather limited. It's only through the payment that we also are inclined to cooperate in projects that we do not personally like, but that are still important for various other peoples. And it's only because of payment, therefore, that we have the development of society to the extent that we do have. Now, saving and the accumulation of capital is also imaginable without payment. Okay, it is imaginable that we have a society in which saving and investment takes place without monetary compensation. But of course, saving and investment in such a society would be very, very small in comparison to what is possible if we offer a remuneration for saving and investment. And that remuneration is called interest. Okay, that's interest. Interest, so the compensation, the monetary compensation offered for savings and investment. Now, in Austrian economics, the interest concept must be distinguished in particular from the monetary price paid for loans on the loan market, and it must also be distinguished from the concept of profit and loss. So that's what I will explain now in the next few minutes. So we must not confuse interest with the payments made for loans, for bank credits and so on. Rather, interest in the Austrian economics framework is a much larger concept. It covers in particular also the premium that an entrepreneur expects to make on his, or the return that an entrepreneur expects to make on his investment. So if I'm an entrepreneur and I invest 100 ounces of gold, and I expect to make a return of 110 ounces, so this 10, right, that is the premium that incites me to this investment, and part of it, at least, is interest. right? So the amount of money that we pay on loans is just a particular form of interest. It is not, doesn't exhaust the entire phenomenon. Now I just said that in this example I invest 100 ounces of gold, and I obtain a return of 110 ounces. I just said that at least part of this is interest. What is the other part? Well, the other part could be either a profit or a loss. Now, what's the difference between interest on the one hand and profit and loss on the other hand? Now, with this 10-ounce spread, and this has an interest component and a profit-loss component. The difference is the following. Interest is the spread that survives in general equilibrium. Now, what is general equilibrium? General equilibrium is a situation in which it is impossible for any market participant to increase his revenue beyond the revenue that he obtains. Okay? Not necessarily the monetary revenue, right, but the total revenue, monetary and psychic revenue. So it cannot, in general equilibrium, therefore, everybody is best off. Nobody can improve his position by making any other choices. Okay? By contrast, if we do not have a situation of general equilibrium, if we have a situation of disequilibrium, that means that at least one market participant, at least one entrepreneur, can increase his monetary profits by doing something else than what he has done. Okay, one example. Let's assume this would be a situation of disequilibrium. Then this implies that by investing 100 ounces in another project, our entrepreneur could have obtained 115 ounces, for example, of gold, so a return of 15 ounces. That is, he has comparatively, so to say, lost 5 ounces in this investment as compared to this investment. Okay, that's what's called economic loss. It's not accounting loss; it's economic loss. Okay, he has made an investment decision that makes him worse off than he could have been had he made another decision. Okay, and in general equilibrium, that is not possible. General equilibrium is defined by the fact there is no alternative that could have been chosen by at least one entrepreneur, thus increasing his revenue. Okay. On the other hand, so here he would have made a loss, an economic loss of 5 ounces. We can also imagine the following case. The next best alternative for investment would have been this. So here our entrepreneur has made a superior spread of 5 ounces as compared to this investment that also takes place on the market. So here he has made an economic profit of 5 ounces. So the total spread that is observed on the market in any company is always composed of 2 elements, and the interest component, which is the component that survives in general equilibrium, and that would exist under any circumstance, and the profit and loss component that comes on top of this. Now, if we have a closer look at the interest component now, we will call this interest component, we will call this the gross interest rate. Okay, and we will look at its own elements, its own components. What are the elements of the interest rate? So we have here the gross interest rate. And it is composed by 3 elements, namely by what is called the pure interest rate, by the price premium, and by the risk premium. pure interest rate is, so to say, the hardcore of the gross interest rate. The price premium might disappear, and the risk premium might also disappear under rather less than more reasonable plausible circumstances. But in any case, the pure interest rate would survive. And according to the standard Austrian theory, conventional Austrian theory, this pure interest rate component is caused by time preference. Right? That is, by the preference for present goods as to compare to future goods. One present apple is more valuable than the same apple in a year from hence. Right? And therefore, in order to incite me to produce an apple that will only exist in a year from hence, one needs to offer me an additional premium, right? Something that goes beyond. I wouldn't exchange just an apple now against an apple in the future. Right? I would produce the apple in the future only if one offered me, well, let's say at least 2 apples in the present or something. Okay. So therefore, $100 in the present are more important, more valuable than the same $100 in the future. In order to incite me to save the $100 now to obtain some future revenue, one cannot just offer me 100 future dollars. Right? One needs to offer me somewhat more. Okay, so one needs to offer me, for example, $110. Right? And this difference then, this $10 difference, that is the interest payment. Now the price premium, the notion goes back to the American economist Irving Fisher. The price premium is the compensation that an investor requires for the loss of purchasing power of money. Right? For example, if the monetary unit loses its purchasing power, then I will require as an investor a corresponding extra premium on top of the pure interest rate to compensate for this loss of purchasing power. And then finally, we also have the risk premium, which is a compensation for particular risks that go in hand with this investment. So again, let's take a numerical example. Let's say we have a pure interest rate of 3%, and we expect a depreciation of the value of money by 2%. And we are considering a particularly risky investment for which we require a premium of 4%. Then the total gross interest rate would add up to 9%. So the interest rate observed on the market, for example in the loan market and so on, is therefore the complex phenomenon. It results from the interaction of various causes: pure interest rate, which is in itself determined by time preference, price premium, that is inflation, and a risk premium. Right? Any variation of any of these one factors will lead to a corresponding variation of the observed interest rate on the market. Right? If inflation goes up, then as a tendency, interest rates go up as well. If we have times of war and so on, then tendentially interest rates go up as well because we require higher risk premiums and so on. So I'm almost ready to conclude. Let me make one additional observation. So what I've done so far is to give you a general introduction to the economics of capital and interest, the basic concepts that come here into play, derive them from human choice in a physical and social context, which in itself is determined by causal laws. I've talked about the laws of return, capital formation, the causes of capital formation, the effects of capital formation. But there's one thing that we did not yet talk about, and of course that would be way too much in our lecture, namely that's the impact of money. Okay? And this, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the great subjects in economic analysis, the impact of variations of the quantity of money on capital accumulation, right, and thus on the speed of economic development. The Austrian position, to summarize this very briefly, is that artificial variations in the money supply are not suitable means to increase economic growth, economic growth beyond the speed that it would otherwise have had. Quite to the contrary, artificial meddling with the money supply through political means and so on is likely to decrease economic growth beyond the level or below the level it would otherwise have reached. Okay, but that is something that I cannot explain to you in this lecture, but which will be the subject of the lecture of Professor Garrison and of other lecturers during the rest of the week. Thank you.
Anybody has any issues at this point?
Can you just explain again real quick what the price premium was?
That's the additional reward that an investor asks for being compensated for the loss of purchasing power.
Would the price premium shrink to zero if there was no inflation?
If there was no inflation, then the price premium would also be zero. Yeah.
Is general equilibrium, is that so-called Pareto efficiency, and what is the Austrian stance on general equilibrium?
Well, I have a lecture later on in the week on general equilibrium. I guess that question would better fit into this one. Yeah.
Would a fourth aspect of determining the interest rate have to do with expected profits? If the average growth in an economy is, 4%, so your average small business entrepreneur expects, if he does the average, he'll make 4%. Would that affect what the market price interest rate is as well?
Well, for any individual investor, it's not important what the average rate is elsewhere, right? What is only important for himself is what he can realize.
Right, but if everybody's working together to come up with the interest rate, it would come to the average, correct?
Well, actually, the interest rate that you observe on the market, right? Therefore, it's a good question, because what we are doing here, what I say, that's the observed interest rate, and it has several components. But of course, the observed interest rate is the result of a selection process that goes on, right? So different capitalists are bidding for scarce capital that they want to invest, and only the most profitable projects get selected. Okay, so strictly speaking, what we have here, the observed interest rate, are the components of the marginal investor. Okay, all other investors that have to pay 9% interest rate on the capital market, but obtain a higher return on this investment in their projects, they are making sort of an economic profit. Right? Only in general equilibrium would everybody just make precisely the 9% return on this capital. Okay.
Last question.
You mentioned interest component and then the profit component. So my question, then you talked about gross interest rate. Now, is that gross interest rate, is that the interest component?
Yes.
Okay. Then could you expand a little bit on the profit and loss component?
Yeah. Again, I will talk about this more at the end of the week in the lecture of the role of general equilibrium in Austrian economic analysis. Very briefly, so the profit and loss component is a component of the spread between the price that I pay for factors of production and the return that I obtain for my products. That is due to somebody's error. Okay. If I make myself an error, that is, if I invest too much in an investment project that is not as profitable as I thought, or not as profitable as other projects that I could have realized as well, I make a loss. Okay.
So you determine it ex post?
Empirically, you do determine it ex post. Right.
Okay, thank you very much, Guido.